And of course, there's different interpretations people can come to, which I think that's
Sure.
important as well, is acknowledging that you, smart, honest people can come to different conclusions or interpretations, but sometimes, and both sides can be guilty of saying the only logical, rational, or correct interpretation is this one. And I think it's important to acknowledge that there's different conclusions someone might come to.
All right. Welcome, everybody, to another episode. I have a guest today. It is the host of Mormonism with Murph. And I believe you have a YouTube channel where you cover like CS letter type topics. You aren't afraid to like talk about those. And you are a practicing Latter-day Saint. So, yeah, anything else I missed about your channel? Or welcome. Hello.
Hi. Yeah. So, well, my name is Stephen, but I've named myself sort of the Murph. Whenever I was thinking of a name for my channel, I was like Mormonism with Stephen. Sounds kind of lame. And on my mission, because you're referred to as like elder or sister, my last name is Murphy, but a lot of the missionaries called me Murph. So I kind of thought, hey, Mormonism with the Murph would be good. But yeah, basically what I try to do is explore different truth claim or church history topics. I want to look at the criticisms and the critical arguments going against and their evidence. I want to try to the best of my ability, steelman and represent that. And I want to look at the best faithful responses, apologetic sort of faithful interpretations, and evidence in favor, and try to be balanced and fair as I explore different topics, and also interview different scholars or historians, apologists, or critics on a topic. And sometimes, I'll do wee videos on like recent church news as well, but predominantly I'm kind of focused on truth claim, church history topics.
Okay. I watched a little bit of your channel, and you had mentioned that a lot of times when people are like first tuning in, they don't know where you are. They can't tell if you're a active member or if you are an ex-Mormon that's being critical of the church. I actually think that's a good thing. Like, how do you balance that? How do you, I guess, how do you explain that? Do you have any reasonings why
Yeah.
you think that happens?
So I think especially in the beginning, whenever I first started the channel, I was back in a bit of a faith crisis again. I was struggling again with doubts. I have been listening to podcasts again, and I've been watching the LDS Discussions series, and it sort of bombarded me again with like things that I really need to figure out, problems and challenges being raised against the truth claims. And I also had friends and family members, a lot of them who had left sort of like the year prior, who were bringing up a lot of their doubts and issues to me. And because I had returned back to the church, they're almost looking to me as like, well, do you have the answers? And I sort of felt like I felt unsatisfied with some of my intellectual answers in those conversations. So whenever I first started the channel, I was very much like, spiritually I still believe, but intellectually I'm really struggling. And I really wanted to I really want to find the truth. So at the beginning, I was like, I'm going to try to be fair. I'm going to try to be as balanced, kind of neutral, kind of objective, but we can't be fully objective. Like, I think
Right.
what one person thinks is objectivity, that's their subjective view of objectivity. But in the beginning, I was like, I'm going to represent what the critics say and then what the faithful side is. And at the start, a lot of people were struggling to figure out my bias because I didn't want to infuse my own views or opinions or interpretations that much and influence people. Because one thing I recognize from listening a lot of either faithful apologetic channels and content or critical is I tend to find that you're quite heavily influenced by the person producing the content.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to make it more based around the sources, the facts. Here's the faithful interpretation, here's the critical one, and I don't want to sway you too much. Now, I would at the end of a series sort of give my analysis, my take, because I don't want to seem like just a robot. And over time, I think there has been a shift where I've wanted to make my stance and my bias more known. So there probably has been a little bit of a shift in my channel where it maybe seems a little bit more leaning faithful or apologetic, while I still strive to be fair and balanced. And I probably interview more faithful scholars or apologist. So I kind of acknowledge that I can't stay in the completely neutral zone.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's
Mm-hmm.
very hard, but you can strive to be fair, strive to be balanced. But there
True.
were a lot of people at the beginning who were a little bit confused at what I was doing.
Huh. So that's interesting. You said you described going through another faith crisis, and that's super interesting. I guess my first question is like, where do you feel you are now? Do you still feel like, um, I don't know how to describe it, like it's a tender thing that you have to be careful with, or are you feeling like you're pretty stable now?
Um, I think certain topics that I've explored, I feel like I've come through a little bit more on the other side. So I did a really big series on the Book of Mormon last year, and the Book of Mormon, it's like it's foundational, like it's the
Hmm.
keystone. And I was a little bit worried going into it because I was like, I want to look at all of the best criticisms going against the naturalistic theories, be it Dan Vogel, William Davis, anachronisms, DNA, things with the King James Bible. I want to look at all the best argument and criticisms going against. And there was this fear of like, maybe this will break my shelf. Maybe I won't be able to, reconcile or figure some things out. I felt in that series, my sort of conclusion is I came out with belief on the other side. In the Book of Mormon and other topics I explored, like the witnesses, and I'm currently doing a series on temples. But back in 2022, I was back in a faith crisis. I'd had my spiritual experiences, which were sort of like my rock that I turned to that brought me back to the church. But it was like intellectually, I was doubting again. I felt like there's a lot of problems that I need to try to find intellectually plausible answers to, or else I may not be able to make this work,
Hmm.
despite what I believe were spiritual experiences. Because if all evidence, all argument, all reason points to it not being what it claims to be, then I feel like my spiritual experience would probably collapse. But if I can find plausible answers and some plausible evidence, not to like prove or debunk every single issue, but enough that I can still maintain confidence in my spiritual experiences, then I'll be able to keep my faith intact.
Okay. Okay. So do you feel like you're intellectually satisfied then, or do you still just have like a metaphorical shelf that you just kind of place things and you're like, I don't really think it's super important. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, did you find peace in that, or did you just like put things on pause again? Not again, but
I think the way I would describe it is certain topics I feel like I don't want to make it seem like I fully dived into it and I'm an expert and I've looked at everything, because you can't fully explore everything. There's always going to be new research and new arguments.
yeah.
But I feel like I have a lot better understanding into a lot of topics. I know the critical arguments and the issues going against. I know more of the wider context that maybe from just listening to podcasts and reading, I maybe didn't fully have, but really trying to dive in a little bit deeper. Um, so I think I've lost my train of thought. Sorry, what was your question again?
Just like, do you feel intellectually satisfied? You were describing this dichotomy of like feeling like you have spiritual experiences that you can remain, an active Latter Day Saint without any problem. But then you had intellectual things that you were
Yeah, no,
wanted to resolve. I guess I'm wondering if you resolved them, because I feel like there's two ways that you can go forward. I feel like you can resolve them, and I think people do resolve them. And then the other thing is just to recognize that it's not that important. Like there's this thing about history that really has nothing to do with the current day church.
mhm.
So I don't, and that's the way I've seen it, or
No,
I look
I
at it.
think for me, I would label some things are like still a question mark. Some things are still a bit of an issue that I feel like I've not found a good debunking answer to this. So you could still say it's still a book on the shelf. Other things which seem like this is a really big sort of smoking gun or a big issue on my shelf with more research, where I find things which sort of would undermine or sort of counter it. So it's maybe
Mhm.
become like, oh, it's not really as big an issue. And then other things it's like, oh, maybe find some positive evidence which has sort of counterbalanced. So I feel like it kind of depends on the topic, depends on the issue. But for example, like things with the Book of Abraham, I've not fully dived in deeply yet. It's going to be one of my next topics in series, and that is a lot of things to do with the Book of Abraham is a shelf item for me. I've not fully found answers that have reconciled it for me intellectually. And I want to confront it, I want to explore it. There are certain things with Joseph Smith's polygamy, even diving in and understanding more of the context, there are still things which are really hard and really difficult and troubling, even with having a faithful interpretation of, it being a revelation and a commandment and Joseph Smith being a prophet. There are still things which are hard to justify, shall we say. But it's having a little bit more understanding and knowing more of the context. So it kind of depends on the issue, the criticism, and the topic, I would say.
Okay. No, that makes sense. And I just want to address, there's a lot of, I think, people that are going to be listening to this, that would be listening to this, that are annoyed that you can just say, oh, it's not important, and then just keep on keeping on because it was so important to them. And it's interesting because I do feel like historical stuff was made important to me by like it being told to me that it was so important when I was like going to church and learning about church history. Like, so at the same time, I do feel like it's okay. I don't know. I don't know if you watched the Kwaku and Kara Burrell, like they had a conversation.
Yes, I did. Yeah.
And it's interesting because, Kara is annoyed that Kwaku isn't following correlation material.
Orthodox position.
Yeah. And it's like, yes, that is annoying. But at the same time, you don't like the Orthodox position. So isn't it better that someone is not living the Orthodox position? But then at the same time, then what is that? That's not Mormonism, is it? So I understand like both sides of that argument, and I'm not sure what to do with it. Like, it's just kind of up in the air for me. Like I look at Kwaku and I'm like, good for you. And then I'm like, yeah, you're right, Kara. Like, I don't know. I struggle with that.
I think the difficult thing with that interview is he was sort of just focusing on, well, let's just look at Mormonism. Let's just focus on Joseph Smith. And he was sort of saying he wasn't really answering the issue she was bringing up regarding the church, our branch of the restoration. So I can understand people's frustration, and for me, just to clarify that I feel like these church history topics or these truth claim topics, I feel like they are important, and that's why I felt the need that I want to dive in, I want to explore them. It's not like, oh well, this historical issue doesn't really matter. Like, to me, it does matter, and like truth and evidence. And that was the purpose, is I want to have more understanding about the evidence and the history. I want to look at the criticisms. Is this a smoking gun criticism? Let's look at the apologetic responses. Is there anything that can challenge or undermine? Is there any evidence in favor? And then people can kind of weigh up for themselves. And there's maybe certain topics where I feel quite good with the faithful position, or I might feel that, you know what, I can equally see there's two different interpretations here that are very plausible. And then there's some where I'm like, I can totally resonate with the critics' interpretation. It's still a bit of a question mark or an issue. And people have to decide for themselves sort of how they deal with that.
Yeah. Do you think it'd be fair to say something along the lines of like, you're not going to stay just because like it's a culturally good thing. You want to be there because like it's true, and that I think that's a respectable position. At the same time, I'm okay with people that want to stay there for cultural reasons too.
Yeah, no. Everyone, we're all different. Everyone has their own journey, their own path, and whatever works for them. But yeah, no, for me, I'm very much in it because I still believe in the foundational truth claims. Obviously, I think there's a lot of nuance and messiness when it comes to things in church history or viewing prophets and scripture and things. But fundamentally, I came back to the church and stay in it because I still believe in the truth claims. If I were to lose belief, I would probably step away.
Do you ever have, like you were talking about listening to LDS Discussions? I think I'm less familiar with that one. Are they new? Is that a newer channel, or did I miss that?
It's like a podcast within Mormon Stories. So LDS Discussions, he has a website called LDS Discussions, and it's basically like, it's similar to like Mormon Think or Letter for My Wife.
Okay.
I think it's a very good synthesis and overview of criticisms and challenges going against the truth claims of the
Okay.
church. So he's been doing a series with John Dillon for probably like 2 years
Okay.
now.
That's probably why. Then I.
Yeah, they've done about 50 different topics. A lot of it's based on the essays he's done on LDS Discussions. And that was probably, amidst some other things, probably the catalyst for me starting my own channel was the LDS Discussion series.
What about it? Like just that you wanted to respond to some of the stuff that he was leaving out, or who is it that hosts it? What's the name?
So
You
it's
know?
John Dillon and Mormon Stories, but it's
Oh, it's John Dolan that's hosts it.
he's hosting it, but the author of LDS Discussions, he goes by the name of Mike.
Oh,
Uh,
so it's like
I don't think that's
anonymous.
actually,
Okay,
yeah, an anonymous person. I
gotcha.
think the reason why it wasn't so much that I wanted to like, okay, I'm gonna debunk this guy. I think it was like, oh, Flip, he's bringing up a lot of some of the things I already knew for my own first faith crisis. So a lot of it was just bringing a lot of things back to my mind. There were some new things, but I felt like it was a really good synthesis of arguments and challenges going against the truth claims of the church. And I think the analogy I would give is I felt like I was in a boxing ring and I was up against the ropes and I was just getting hit by just, so many punches. And I was just like on the defense. I was just getting hit. And I felt like, I don't know if I have really good defense to this. And I felt the need that like I need to fully confront and explore for myself. And if I can find answers to it, then great. But if not, I can't ignore or hide away from this. I need to fully dive in. I felt like I can't ignore this, despite feeling like I've had experiences that brought me back and believing again. I was like, I really need to figure out these criticisms and challenges that are being brought up.
Okay. And then do you feel like there's topics that you get the sense that ex-Mormons shy away from that are like good arguments for um, the truth claims of the church? And
Yeah,
I don't know if that makes sense. Like, does it? I know that like when I talk to my brother, for example, he's always bringing up some of the same topics, and I don't hear those topics in the ex-Mormon world. And I'm wondering if
yeah.
there are some topics like that where you're like, why won't they address this? Or whatever.
Yeah, and actually, right before I started my channel, I reached out to a few different well-known podcasters in the critical space, and I said that I really appreciate if you guys could do a response or bring on a scholar to like say these 5 different topics or look at these videos, which I see as quite good evidence in favor. And
Hmm.
if you can debunk it, if you can show why it doesn't hold up, like I really want to see it because I sort of felt, and I think this is something that added to my confusion, was that I didn't see all evidence and arguments going against the church, or if the church isn't what it claims to be, if Joe Smith was a fraud. I sort of felt like, how do you account for some of these things as well? And
Hmm.
those were some things that I came across whenever I was out of the church
Hmm.
that caused a little bit of dissonance. They didn't cause me to believe again, but they opened my mind to the possibility of maybe I'm wrong, or maybe I don't have all the information, or how do I explain this if, Joe Smith just made it all up?
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, sometimes I feel that there's certain topics or evidence that I will get into on my channel that I will steal because I feel like for the most part, maybe I'm not perfect, but I get complimented that a lot of people feel like I represent fairly the critical arguments and the issues they're bringing up,
Hmm.
but I often don't feel like they do it for what I see as the best evidence in favor on certain topics.
Oh, that's interesting. Can you share some of those topics? I'm curious.
Yeah, so the ones I would give, I would say number one would be the witnesses of the gold plates. In my personal opinion, I feel that the critics focus on a few second or third hand statements, the ones in CS Ladder,
Hmm.
Mormon Think. And whenever I first read those statements, I thought, oh boy, these guys, they just have this magical worldview,
Hmm.
visionary mindset. I didn't really see the plates. I saw the plates as I see a city through a mountain, quotes from Martin Harris.
Hmm.
And whenever I looked at those quotes, I just thought, well, these guys aren't credible. Whenever I was out of the church, I listened to a podcast called LDS Truth Claims.
Hmm.
And I remember he just went through loads of their first or second hand statements of the witnesses, which I'd never heard before. I'd never heard from any critic, where they were just over and over very emphatic that, I saw the angel, I know I saw the plates. Um, Very emphatic statements. And I sort of recognized that critics were only focusing on maybe a few second or third hand statements that made the witnesses sound like these guys aren't credible. And I thought at the time that if we're going to be fully transparent, we should present all of their sources, and then you can draw your own interpretation. And whether or not the witnesses really did, see the angels, see the plates, hear the voice of God, or the 8 witnesses were showing the plates, it kind of comes down to faith. But I felt like we should represent their testimonies accurately. And as I looked through them all, they were very emphatic. I know I saw the angel, I know I saw the plates. And I felt like the vast majority of their statements were quite faithful. I think other topics, I remember exploring the connections between our temple endowment and ancient temple rites, particularly like early Christian liturgy and rituals, and even comparing the coronation ceremonies of a monarch or like a priestly initiation in the Old Testament. And there are some early Christians called the Gnostics. They're kind of seen as like heretical by the Christian church, but they performed these secret rituals, which they claimed, they received from the apostles who received it from Christ after his resurrection, that had some really striking correspondences to things in our temple endowments. And as an ex-Mormon, my view was, Joseph Smith, a couple of months before the temple endowment, he was a Mason, he became a master Mason. There's undeniable connections between Masonry and the temple endowment. Therefore, it's obvious Joseph just plagiarized from Masonry. And whenever I looked into the connections to these ancient temple rites, it added more complexity. And there are claims of like, this is Joseph restoring ancient rites. And I think what I realized is that someone could make the argument that Masonry perhaps could have been a catalyst. Yeah, but perhaps there could have been restoration of the ancient rites. Or if it is just him making it up out of his 19th century environment, why do we see some of these striking correspondences to things that priests did in the Old Testament, early Christians? I find that really interesting. And I think Bill Reel and someone else did do a video responding to a video I sent them a year and a half, which I really appreciated. But other than that, I've not really seen any critics really deal with it. And for me, I sort of, again, thought at the time whenever I was out of the church, wasn't believing, but was encountering some of this information, these podcasts, I find the correspondences quite striking. That would definitely be one thing. The Book of Enoch as well, and the Book of Giants, and I think also some of the evidence for the Book of Mormon, complexity, or things in the Old World. I think Old World geography converges quite well, in my opinion, with the text of the Book of Mormon. And sometimes I feel like it's strawmanned a bit by critics, because whenever I first left, I would have thought like, no, it's just NHM on the altar. It's just a coincidence, and these apologists are making a bigger deal. But what I found quite astounding was how it's not just NHM and an altar, but it's the whole travel through Arabia, which to me at the time I thought correlated and converged very well with the text, particularly the eastward turn to Bountiful. And at the time, I thought to myself, it only made sense to me that Joseph had some sort of a map, to have done it. It seemed to correlate and converge very well in my mind. So those would be some things which I feel that maybe aren't fully addressed or fully steel-manned, shall we say, by critics, even some of them maybe the fulfilled prophecies of Joseph Smith. So I guess I've no problem with critics wanting to point out the problems or evidence that challenges, because I want to hear the best arguments against. But I feel that if really truth and transparency is what we're about, then we would want to hear the best evidence in favor. If you want to make an informed decision, as John DeLynn would often say, then you want to try to present all of the data as best as you can. And something that might seem like for example, going back to Masonry and the Temple Endowment, if you only had that bit of information that Joseph was a Mason, a couple of months later we had the Temple Endowment, looked at all these things with the clothing or with the ritual or the signs and the tokens, look at all things that are similar. The only logical conclusion you would come to is that, oh, he just took it from Masonry. But whenever I saw all of these other correspondences to ancient temple rites, it muddied the water a little bit, made me realize that maybe it's not just quite as simple as, oh, he just took it from Masonry. And of course, there's different interpretations people can come to, which I think that's important as well, is acknowledging that smart, honest people can come to different conclusions or interpretations, but sometimes, and both sides can be guilty of saying the only logical, rational, or correct interpretation is this one. And I think it's important to acknowledge that there's different conclusions someone might come to.
I I like that a lot. I think that is a big mistake with any difference divide is that the assumption that the opponent that you're talking to is either uninformed or dishonest and not an honest interlocutor, or that they um, are too stupid to understand. Like those are like, or evil. Like that's another one.
Yeah, and
um,
I've reached out to people like some of these different podcasters or scholars, and I've said like if there's really good debunking answers to this, like I want to hear your response. If there's something that challenges or undermines, or if the apologists are making a bigger deal of this evidence than what it really is, I want to know. I'm sort of open, but I guess I want transparency, and I want sort of all the data to be out there. So I guess that's what I'm trying to do with my channel, but of course your bias can come in that it's it's harder for me to want to do a video about something which is very faith challenging or faith demoting.
mhm.
Yeah, it's hard for me to want to do that, particularly because like you have faithful listeners as well, but it's trying to step past that and try to present information whether it's faith promoting or not.
Yeah, I um, I think that's a good wish is that you could. It's like with anything with echo chambers in general. It's I wish that the people in the echo chamber could be more fully informed of what's going on in the other echo chamber, right?
Yeah,
Yeah, that's
I think it's good.
and
I
it
think it's
doesn't
good.
even it might not even change their conclusion. It's like you said, that might not even change their mind, but at least they're aware of it, and I think that can't hurt anything.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like for example, I've been doing my series on the Book of Mormon, and I probably interviewed maybe 10 or 15 different scholars and apologists, and the vast majority were faithful ones.
Hmm.
And it was me sort of hearing the evidence and then challenging, bringing up all the criticisms. And I knew I was like, I need to bring on a couple of critics or critical scholars to sort of challenge me as well. I need to be willing to hear their side as well.
Hmm.
I think it's not good to be in an echo chamber
Yeah.
because yeah, both sides can be guilty of that, and sometimes you need someone from the other side who can challenge you a little bit, and then you can refine your position. Maybe you're like, okay, maybe like Hebraisms and chiasms, maybe that's not like the strongest evidence for the Book of Mormon. So you kind of refine your arguments when they're being challenged by someone on the other side.
Hmm. Um, can I ask you some? So I wanted to ask you a little bit about your original, like when you felt like your belief was collapsing, and like how long were you away from activity in the church, and what was that about? And then how far
Mhm.
gone do you feel like you were? Like, are
Yeah.
you as far gone as anybody can get, or maybe you were doubting your doubts a little bit? I don't know. Yeah, tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so well, just like briefly a little bit of background, like I grew up in the church at age 14. I would say I gave my own sort of personal testimony. I deeply like studied the gospel and pondered and felt like I received spiritual manifestations and experienced the atonement and like witness answers to prayer and miracles. So I felt like I really did have a testimony. I fully believed in the plan of salvation, in the restoration of the gospel in the church and Joseph Smith's first vision. My mission, I would say, solidified and sort of further converted me, and I just didn't have any doubts. It's like there was no reason to doubt or
Yeah.
question. I hadn't encountered any reason to doubt or question. Just it all just seemed perfect. It all made sense, and I did have a very fundamentalist, literalistic view of the church, gospel, prophet, scripture. I was very much sort of like a Bruce R. McConkie, Joseph Fielding Smith. That was the Mormonism that I grew up with. And it was whenever I was home for a mission, I had a sister who had left the church. She had issues with, church history, Joseph Smith, things with prophets, things with the current church and its wealth. And I wanted to help resolve her concerns. And I'd never gone looking for anything that's like anti-Mormon or critical. Like we're cautioned in the church, don't listen to anti-Mormon material. It's anti-Mormon lies and it will deceive you. But I wanted to help my sister. I wanted to help bring her back to the church. But in order to help her, like I had to know her concerns. And I think I went in knowing that like either these things will be like lies that I'll be able to debunk, or like I'll be able to find answers to it. So I didn't go in with like a fearful mindset. I was kind of curious.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, she just started sharing with me, issues with things in church history, like Joseph Smith drinking wine in Carthage jail, or Joseph Smith having a seer stone they use, in translating the Book of Mormon, they used in, folk magic and treasure digging. Then that went on to learning about Joseph Smith's practice of polygamy and polyandry and, marriages to teenage girls and keeping it, secret from his wife Emma, and public denials, and then the different naturalistic theories for the Book of Mormon, anachronisms, DNA, 19th century influences. Then it went on to the Book of Abraham. So within like a couple of months, I was like down the rabbit hole. I remember initially it was Grant Palmer had a big influence on me. She shared with me a couple of podcasts, and I ordered his book, An Insider's View of Mormon Origins. Then I was listening to like Sandra Tanner, and I was reading through Mormon Think, and I came across Dan Vogel on YouTube, his YouTube channel. So I was listening to a lot of different critics online. Then I came across Mormon Stories. And at the time, I was working on night shift, so I could put my earphones in and listen to as much content as I wanted. So within like 2 or 3 months, I was like fully down like the critical rabbit hole, and just learning so many troubling things in church history that were really hurting the views and beliefs that I had. Like I felt like it was irreconcilable. So yeah, within a couple of months, I tried having a couple of meetings with priesthood leaders, sharing my concerns, and I felt that, while they were compassionate and empathetic, I didn't find great answers. And I went to Fair Mormon and wasn't satisfied by some of the apologetic answers on there. I think it was the fact that they confirmed, or like the Gospel Topics
Right.
essays confirmed some of the troubling things in church history, but tried to give like a faithful interpretation.
Yeah, that was hard. Sometimes I learn new
That was
things
hard.
at Fair Mormon.
Yeah, I guess part of me was kind of hoping that these were just going to be anti-Mormon lies.
Yeah.
And what I realized is that a lot of it is, based upon factual history. Sometimes, it's like disputable sources, or there's different interpretations, but a lot of the time this was based upon factual things in our church history.
Yeah.
So I very quickly lost my faith. I no longer believed Joseph was a prophet. I went kind of, because I was very black and white.
Mm-hmm.
My view of Joseph Smith was like, have you seen the 2005 Prophet of the Restoration movie with Joseph
probably.
Smith?
Yeah, I'm sure I did.
The picture of like this hero of a prophet, like kind of like next to Jesus in righteousness, and I absolutely loved Joseph Smith, but it was a very idealistic, simplistic view of church history.
Is this the one where like he is cleaning the rug and the guy walks by and he's like,
yes,
that's Emma's job, and he's like, yeah, but you gotta treat your wife well, or something like that.
Yeah,
I can't remember, but
I would have read the book like Our Heritage as well, but it was a very faith promoting, simplistic, and you could say like a whitewashed version of church history. I didn't learn about any of the troubling things like just using a seer stone, or Abraham, or polygamy, or the priest. Well, I was kind of aware of the priesthood ban, but I hadn't been exposed to a lot of the very racist quotes justifying it. So I think because I had very literalistic views of scripture, I was sort of an inerrantist and fundamentalist. Like all scripture is literally the word of God. Of course, we believe the Bible as far as is translated correctly, and believe that certain things might have been mistranslated or things removed. But at least like the Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants, Pearl of Great Price, I believe like this is literally the word of God. I viewed prophets as infallible. Like they wouldn't be wrong about doctrine or revelation. So I couldn't reconcile that with the things that I was learning. So yeah, I left church. I was serving as young men's president, and I wrote a letter to my bishop, basically outlining all my concerns and why I no longer believe. And I felt like with integrity, I can't stay in the church if I don't believe in its truth claims. So yeah, I wrote a letter to my bishop, resigned from my calling. I threw all my garments in a bin. I put all my Mormon like books and missionary journals away in like a cupboard. And in my mind, I felt like I was done. I completely felt like I lost belief. I still had belief in God and in Jesus, and I was still open to Christianity, but the Mormonism stuff, and I'd reinterpreted some of my spiritual experiences as feelings based on only being exposed to like a faith promoting, sanitized view of the history. And
Mm-hmm.
if I was exposed to all the information, maybe I wouldn't have had those experiences. So I lost some faith in the reliability of spiritual experiences.
Okay. That's interesting. So, did you ever have any discussions with Christians then, or did you ever go down learn more about Christianity in general? Because I did that a little bit, and I realized, oh, I don't know anything about like mainstream Christianity. Like, it is different
Yeah.
than Mormonism.
So I was quite heavily influenced by Grant Palmer and the Tanners, and I was listening
Okay, yeah,
during
because
this
they're
time to a
Christian,
lot
huh?
of, yeah, to different YouTubers like the Wilders,
Yes.
Micah and Lynn Wilder. I was listening to them. I read through her book. Man, I was listening to channels like God Loves Mormons, and I think it was a girl called like It's Jessie, and they're pointing out all the problems with Mormonism and how the some of the doctrines conflict with the Bible. I was even listening to Apologia, like Jeff Durbin and James White. So I was really listening to a lot of Christian apologetics, a lot of attacks on Mormonism. And I ordered like an NIV of the Bible. So I read the New Testament, but I was like, I'm not going to read it in the King James version.
Mm-hmm.
And I was attending different Christian churches, and I was actually in a relationship with a girl who was Christian. So I was really exploring Christianity. And even though I'd lost some faith or trust in like spiritual experiences, I was
Mm-hmm.
still very much open to God and Jesus. I didn't feel the need to throw them out. And
Okay.
I think also certain experiences that I viewed as like answers to prayer, I found hard to deny. So I still believe that, hey, maybe that was God, but it just doesn't mean Mormonism's true.
Mm-hmm.
So I was going to Christian churches and reading the Bible and really wanted to have like a born again spiritual experience. I really wanted to feel like have this come to Jesus moment. I still believed in Jesus,
Mm-hmm.
and I was open to it. I think one of the things that I became a little bit disillusioned with Christianity, maybe it's just certain doctrines that I found troubling, or I found it hard to fully accept, like the Trinity.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't feel like it was really explicitly in the Bible. Kind of, to me, it seemed like a man-made doctrine to harmonize the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
The Bible talks about there only being one God, but then Jesus is referred to as God, the Father is referred to as God, the Holy Spirit is. Well, the Bible can't contradict itself. It's one unified, univocal work. So it's one God, but three persons.
Yeah.
And I would never come to that conclusion from reading the Bible.
Right.
And even like, heaven and hell, and that those who don't accept Jesus are just going to go to an eternal hell of torment. And some Christians, some pastors, and people I was listening to online were implying that Mormons, you worship a false Jesus. It's a different Jesus. It's a different gospel, and you're not going to be saved. You're going to go to hell. My mom had just passed away like a few months before I
Mm.
left the church, and she was very devout, but she was so faithful. Like she was a true saint, like just like an angel on earth, like a true disciple of Jesus Christ. Like she didn't just like talk about living the gospel, like she really did. And if there is an afterlife, like if there's a heaven, I had absolutely no doubt that she was there. And it didn't matter what they said. I knew that she wasn't in hell. I knew that no good loving God would send her there. So I felt a bit disillusioned, and I
Mm-hmm.
was going to a Presbyterian church, and not all Christians believe in this, so I don't want to misrepresent, but they
Sure.
believe that God's already predestined or pre-chosen who's going to be saved and who's not. And I find that, very deeply troubling. And I was like, there's things I don't like about Mormonism, things I don't like about Smith. I was like, kingdoms of glory, and that sounds a lot more merciful than either heaven or, an eternal hell, or having the opportunity to receive the gospel in the next life. And I remember, this is kind of funny. I remember a friend brought up to me after I left the church, but I was still like a Christian. He was like, "So you're a Christian now?" I'm like, "Yeah." And then he was like, "So what about the people who don't believe in Jesus? They just go to like an eternal hell?" And I was like, "Oh," I was like, "Well," I was like, "I don't think God's gonna send them to like an eternal hell, or like maybe he'll give them like an opportunity in the next life to accept Jesus." And I was kind of like bringing in my Mormonism, which was kind of funny. Um, and
It's
then
like, oh wait, there's another belief system that already has that. That's funny.
And I started looking into like things with biblical scholarship. I remember listening to like David Bockavoy and Bart Ehrman on Mormon stories and some of the
Mm.
challenges they were presenting towards both the Old and the New Testament. And I think I felt that Christians, they were so good at attacking Joseph Smith and look at all the problems with the Book of Mormon. There's no archaeological evidence. Look at all these inconsistencies. But then like there were you could
Their own set of
there was
problems.
yeah, there's contradictions and problems with the Bible. There's not archaeological evidence that there was Abraham or Moses or for like the Exodus. Some of the Bible stories are very hard to believe, and even in the Gospels, like there's differences in the crucifixion or resurrection accounts. So I began to realize that yeah, there's some problems. If you're going to be really critical of Mormonism, you need to apply the same to the Bible, and that there were some problems there. So then that caused me to almost go into a deeper faith crisis of like what like I don't believe that the Book of Mormon is inspired, but how do I know that the New Testament is inspired? How do I know who really wrote the Gospels? How do I know
Hmm.
Paul was inspired? Some of the things he said about women seem really sexist, and then I was like, what if none of it's true? And at this time, I was really calling into question: is there a Jesus? Is there a God? Are all my spiritual experiences just coincidence or elevation emotion or something in my mind?
Hmm.
And I think that was when I was really in the dark night of the soul, almost questioning like, who am I? What the heck is this? What is the purpose of my existence? Like, what is the nature of reality? That was probably my deeper faith crisis where I was really wrestling.
Hmm. How long did that last? So you kind of went down. One of my questions was, did you go down like an atheist rabbit hole? And it sounds like you at least started to, or maybe it was full on. I don't know.
Um, I started to intellectually, I was definitely considering it. I
Hmm.
probably went through a few weeks of like agnostic slash confused.
Hmm.
Um, and it was around the same time where so I would get into discussions with my dad. He was still in the church, and one of the reasons why I didn't remove my name is because my dad didn't want me to, and with my mom not passing away that long ago. But in my mind, I kind of saw it as like I was gone, and I wasn't expecting or intending to return. And
Hmm.
we would have regular discussions and conversations. And my dad, he was quite like doctrinally knowledgeable. He knew the scriptures quite well, and I had a lot of respect for him. But I felt in our discussions, I felt like his apologetics were just terrible. I felt like I won every every intellectual argument we had. I was pretty much just like rehearsing the CS ladder, and I felt like he had terrible responses. But we would have lots of discussions. But sort of like the turning point, like with what we were talking about earlier, he sent me like a podcast about like connections between ancient temple rituals. I think it was like an ancient Egyptian temple ritual and the temple endowment. And I was like, Dad, I was like, I don't want to watch this apologetic mumbo jumbo pseudo scholarship. Like, I already know it's not true. And my dad was like, well, just watch it. And I remember like I kind of realized that I'm being very dismissive. I'm not being open minded. I was open minded enough to research the church in the first place and to examine the truth claims. I was like, right, I'll just watch it. And there were some interesting things, and that sort of caused me to be like, I've looked at some apologetics, but like this is completely new to me. And I was like, I didn't know about this. So then I started to go down maybe more like the faithful evidence sort of rabbit hole. And then
Hmm.
that caused like more, I would say, confusion. It didn't cause me to like believe again in my mind. It didn't answer all the issues or doubts or questions, but it made me realize that like this is a little bit more complex, or I didn't see that all evidence pointed against. Whereas when I was first in my faith crisis, I felt like I 100% knew it wasn't true. Whereas now I was beginning to see some things in favor. So then I was sort of in like this period where I was just like confused. I was torn between like all the problems with Mormonism, some evidence I'm now seeing in favor of it, all the attacks that Christians make on Mormonism, problems with the Bible. Will I be agnostic? Will I be Christian? Maybe there's a Jesus, but all religions are false. Should I come back to the church? I was just like, I don't really know
Hmm.
what
And
I'm going to do.
what's the time frame of this all? Like you mentioned that
Uh,
you
so I left the church in 2018, um, and then this is coming up to about summer of 2019.
okay, so about a yearish
Yeah.
of this
Um,
whole timeline.
And what was the thing that kind of triggered me to come back to the church? And I've shared this in other places, but in a nutshell, someone sent me the talk "Stand Forever" by Elder Corbridge. And a lot of people view his talk as he's saying like, oh, there's lots of secondary questions, there's lots of issues in church history, but just focus on the primary questions. Don't worry about the secondary ones. Just focus on the primary ones. And if you have answers to that, then that answers the secondary ones. That wasn't really what I actually took away from his talk. I didn't feel like that was the message he was saying. He did acknowledge that there's a lot of people struggling with the church, with issues with church history, or things with Joseph Smith, and having a lot of issues. And he did talk about like how there's primary questions and secondary questions. But I felt like the point of his talk was like, even if you find answers to the secondary questions, it will still not answer the primary questions. And the primary ones, I think he said things like, is there a God who is our Father? Is Jesus Christ the Savior? Was Joseph Smith a prophet? Is the Book of Mormon true? Is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Lord's restored church? And I sort of took from that, like he was saying, that you could spend a lifetime trying to figure out all these secondary questions, looking at all the evidence going against everything for, and even if you find plausible answers, it still doesn't mean you still don't find answers to the primary questions. So like, say, for example, with all the criticisms leveled against Joseph Smith's first vision, even if you felt like you're able to find plausible answers to all those criticisms, it still doesn't answer if Joseph Smith had his first vision. Even if you're able to answer plausibly all the criticisms, he still could have just made it up. So I kind of took that as his point. But the thing that sort of touched me was he sort of held up the scriptures and said, like, ask yourselves, ask God, are these lies, delusion, or truth? And I had interpreted Joseph Smith in the Book of Mormon that he was either, a con man, and that he plagiarized from, sources, and he was just like a creative genius and just orally dictated and composed the Book of Mormon, borrowing from like the King James Bible and the Mound Builder myth and Protestant sermons, and stealing his own father's dream, and was telling stories to his family members, and that there was anachronisms, and that he was just put that all together. Or I was considering the pious fraud theory, listening more to Dan Vogel and reading Rough Stone Rolling. I thought it was maybe a little bit too simplistic to just label him as just a pure con man.
Mm-hmm.
But it was that sort of bold declaration that touched me, and it kind of, because I still deep down believed in God, but I felt like a lot of Christians were telling Mormons, like, you shouldn't pray about the Book of Mormon. That's how you get deceived. Like, you can't trust your feelings. But I felt that, like, I feel like one of the most primary things that Jesus taught is like, asking you shall receive, knocking it shall be open unto you. Like, if I believe there's a God, he's only worth believing in if I believe he'll actually answer me and speak to me.
Mm-hmm.
And if I don't trust that he can answer and speak to me, then there's no point believing in him. So I decided to, fast and pray, very sincerely, just pouring out all my confusion, doubts, all my concerns, all the things I was wrestling with, really wanting to, make the right decision, and I'm willing to come back to the church, or go down the Christianity path, like, if God to just confirm what's true, what's the right path for me. And I sort of promised that I'll follow if you speak to me, but I need more than a feeling, because I didn't trust feelings anymore. And after that, I experienced what I would describe as, I believe that I had spiritual experiences. I believe that when I turned to the scriptures, that passages that I read seemed like direct answers to me, and I experienced very strong illumination and enlightenment in my mind, which was beyond anything I had experienced, and
Mm-hmm.
the joy in my soul, which was just very, very powerful. And I still wrestle with it, and I felt like I had numerous other spiritual confirmations where it seemed like it was the Lord directly answering me. And I believed that, well, I wasn't sure. I was like, either this was just coincidence and elevation emotion, or maybe this is God answering me, and me experiencing spiritual revelation. And it came to the point where I had to make a decision.
Mm-hmm.
I had to weigh up these experiences, because those were the things, nothing intellectually, I don't think, would have caused me to believe again. It might have caused me to like really like consider again. I think some of those apologetic things opened up my mind to the possibility.
Mm-hmm.
but it was those experiences that caused me to believe again in my heart. And yeah, I had to weigh up the experiences, and do I think it was just coincidence? Do I think it was just elevation emotion, or do I think this was God answering my prayers and experiencing spiritual revelation? I sort of concluded that if I believe there's a God, I have to trust that I think this was Him answering my prayer at this really important moment in my life. Because if there is a God, but this wasn't Him answering my prayer, that wouldn't make much sense to me. If I went to the next day, I'd be like, what the heck, God? I was like, this was like the most urgent, heartfelt prayer. It was such a huge junction in my life. And I had like these passages that seemed like you directly speaking to me, and like these powerful enlightenment, illumination, and joy. And you're telling me that was just a coincidence. Like that didn't make sense to me. So I decided to exercise faith and go back to the church. So I wrote an email to my stake president telling him basically a lot of things that had transpired, and that I'm going to come back again. I believe that I've had spiritual experiences. So yeah, I returned to the church, and I felt on a real spiritual high at the time, because during that like month period, it felt like revelation was just like pouring down. Like every time I would pray, turn to the scriptures, it seemed like I was getting a direct answer, or turning to a talk, and it seemed like it was God really trying to speak to me during this time. So I was on like a real spiritual high and felt really pumped. And returning back to the church, to me, it almost felt like coming back to my spiritual home in a way. Almost like the prodigal son returned, and it was a joyful time.
That's cool. When you very first came back to church, there was nothing that you were like, ugh.
Like, oh yeah, there definitely was.
Okay.
Somebody said to me like, "Oh,
I was like, I don't know if I could ever switch that off."
No, because that's the tough thing. Is because like, and at this time I hadn't really thought through exactly how do I reconstruct. That maybe took a little bit of time. I was like, I believe again. I believe God has spoken to me. So I believe that the scriptures are inspired and contain His words. That this is His church. But I hadn't really sorted through like all the messy issues and how do I reconstruct my view of scripture and prophets. But I remember like my first Sunday back, somebody said like, "Oh, we saw you like a month ago, and you had such a dark countenance, and you looked miserable. And now that you're back, we can see this light again." And I just kind of like rolled my eye, like that kind of annoyed me.
Because you're really down.
Yeah.
Now you're really happy.
Or maybe that's just how I look. And I remember, this is quite funny. I went to a YSA convention like literally 2 weeks after coming back, which is where I met my wife. But there was a really creepy, weird talk given by Area 70 all about sex, and it was more explicit and more weird than a sex ed talk at school.
Oh.
It like some of the things he said were just weird, creepy, uninspired. I remember sitting there being like, God, are you sure you mean this church? Like, you want me to come back here? Like, what is this guy on about? Obviously I had shifted my views. So I didn't believe everything prophets or apostles or church leaders said was like, inspired or like the mind and will of God.
Mm-hmm.
But that was definitely something where I was like, oh my gosh, like this is hard. But yeah, for the most part, I think it was not too difficult a readjustment back the first few months. I think I was on a real spiritual high. I was turning to the scriptures again. I was reading BYU devotionals, and I felt like I was really connecting with God again and with the Savior again.
Mm-hmm. So you were just mentioning that your beliefs had shifted a little bit, and earlier you'd said that you had a very fundamentalist belief. I'm curious what the difference between a fundamentalist belief and your current belief is. Like, where's the differences, I guess?
Right, that's a really good question. So I would say like I did believe again in the true claims of the church. So I did believe again in Joseph Smith and the first vision and the coming forth of the Book of Mormon, and gold plates and priesthood restoration, and that we have priesthood keys. So I did believe again in truth claims. So for example, I think something that I had to shift or change was my view of prophets. That prophets are fallible, not just that they can make moral mistakes, but even be wrong when it comes to doctrine or discerning the mind and will of God. And I think I grew up believing that, and I think this is partly coming from church leaders, but also like church culture and what we were sort of told at church, that I assumed and believed like every week the prophets and apostles met with Jesus or at least when the prophet went to the Holy of Holies, Jesus was speaking with them. So they had a very direct pipeline to God. And I think my view has shifted that they receive revelation probably similarly to the way that I receive it for my life for the most part. And that as I'm trying to wrestle and discern and distinguish revelation as well, and that it usually will only come when it's urgently sought for. So I think I had to shift my view of prophets, and also I would say scripture as well, because I said before, like I viewed scripture as literally like the words of God, and I think I have shifted more to that. There's always a human component to revelation, that it's not literally God speaking, unless it's like a divine messenger, a divine being, but it's often being filtered through the person receiving the revelation. They're having to channel it, include it in their language and in their weakness. And like with the Doctrine and Covenants, there's been changes from the Book of Commandments to the subsequent editions, and I don't know how to reconcile that with, oh, this is literally God's words. So I kind of had to shift my view of scripture, that it's not fixed or inerrant or infallible. And also, you know, like there's some parts where it's like in the Bible where this seems like myth, or this seems like a different genre, allegory. There's parables. Some of the letters of Paul, I'm like, okay, this isn't Paul. This isn't God literally speaking. This is Paul speaking, writing letters to the different Christian churches. Maybe there's still true principles in there. And maybe there's some things where I don't think Paul's quite right in this comment about women. So there's a lot more like nuance. So I kind of saw like, I can't defend that everything in scripture is like the mind and will of God. Like there can be errors, there can be human interpretation, or maybe not everything's literally historical. And that's kind of hard, because one thing that's tough is then you're like, well, how do you know what's from God and what's not? Or how do you know what's literally historical and what's not? And that's quite complex. So that's definitely been something that I've had to shift and wrestle with, which I'm still sort of navigating through as well. So I think that's been a big one. Definitely my views about like Book of Mormon geography. So I would have believed like the Book of Mormon was hemispheric. Growing up, that was my assumption, and that the Native Americans, that they all descended from the Lamanites, and you know, science, DNA would debunk this. But also I feel like analyzing the text of the Book of Mormon more closely, it seems like it's more of a limited geography they're traveling in. So I've shifted more from a hemispheric geography to more of a limited geography, but there's still debate over like which geographical model. I lean more towards Mesoamerica, and that there's obviously other populations here. So that's definitely a change as well, I'm sure, with others, but those are probably the main big shifts I've had to make.
Okay. That's it sounds like you definitely still have like a little skeptic in your head that is understanding of what people are going to be saying. I don't even know if I need, because I was about to ask you something, and you're like, and I understand that this is kind of loosey goosey, and then like, how do you?
Oh like, yeah, of course. So, like I feel like,
I mean, that's the
critical thinking, the skeptic. The I always have that in my mind.
Yeah.
And I think it's a blessing and a curse. I'm grateful for it in a way, for my experience losing my faith, because I'll always have that critical thinking. And I really do understand and resonate with how a lot of ex-Mormons feel, and the criticisms they bring up, because I don't want to say like I was there and now I have like overcome it. I don't want to come across like that, but I can fully resonate. Like it's rational, logical, understandable. And yeah, it's
your spiritual experiences.
Say again?
Like without having those spiritual experiences, you very well could be still there, right?
if I'm gonna be honest with you, if I got no answer, like during that time I was fasting and praying, I would have became the other co-host on Mormon Stories, or would have been an ex-Mormon TikToker, you know, putting out content against her. Like it was quite a big turning point, because some people have said to me, and it's kind of funny, because you know when people leave the church, people often say like they never really believed in the first place, or that you know they couldn't hack the commandments, they were just sinning, they were just weak. trying to find all these reasons to like
They didn't read
invalidate.
their scriptures.
Yeah,
Lazy
instead of saying
learners.
like, maybe they've come to like the honest conclusion for themselves in their minds.
Yeah.
It no longer works for them. It doesn't hold up. They don't
It was
believe in it.
actually hard to leave.
Yeah. But what's kind of funny is whenever I shared my returning back to the church, I think I shared an episode. There was some same rhetoric by people in the ex-Mormon community. It was kind of funny.
Yeah, I'm sure there
Some
was.
people were saying things like, he never really left the church. He never really stopped believing. He couldn't really hack the ex-Mormon life. He couldn't hack all the cognitive dissonance and not being sure about having like a belief system. And like, there's maybe like some fairness to that, but like, I felt like they were just doing the complete opposite of what members do when people leave. I find that quite funny. Instead of just validating that maybe he sincerely believes he has these experiences and honestly return back to the church, whether or not you don't have to agree with it. You can think I'm right or wrong, but it's just quite funny because I think it's human nature. We like to invalidate.
It's
people.
very easy to dismiss someone that comes to a different. You have to almost in order to like maintain that you are right. You have to dismiss people that disagree with you. I think that's the main reason we do that.
Yeah.
And I'm guilty of it. Like I can't say I'm above it. So it just, that's how it is, I guess.
No. And for me, I guess in the years since I've been back, so I've been back like 3 or 4 years now. It's been a wrestle. Like, as I said, there's still that skeptic, that critic in my head. And sometimes you're debating things over, and it's been hard to reconstruct because I feel like there's always that critically thinking person as well. And over the years, maybe I explored different apologetics and felt like I've kind of worked this out and I'll just leave things to one side. But then something happens, or you come across a podcast, or you come across the LDS Discussion series, Letter from My Wife, and it resurfaces those things. And that was sort of what led me to I really need to dive into these things. But this time, because the first time I think I sort of felt like I need to either choose between my spiritual experiences or the evidence. I sort of just threw away my spiritual experiences. And going in this time, I don't want to just completely throw them away. I want to take them into account, although of course they're not evidence to anyone else. Yeah. I see them as evidence that I can't just fully dismiss, but I also feel like I need to take into account all of the data, all of the evidence. And then if I were to come to a conclusion that everything seems to go against, then I may have to reevaluate these experiences. But if I can find plausible answers or evidence to support, even if there's still some remaining questions or issues, I can still hold on to some of these spiritual experiences.
Yeah. So, yeah, I was wondering if there's anything like, do you regret going through that? Do you feel like you wish you would have had, well, I guess, let me go back a little bit. I'll come back to that question. Do you feel like your fundamentalist view was taught to you, or how did that develop? Like, it seems to me, this is one of my issues with apologetics sometimes, is that they will blame members for having a fundamentalist view, but it's like, where did they get that view? They got it from church, didn't they?
Yeah. Oh, definitely.
So no, I grab that. I can have respect for someone that updates their belief, but my hypothesis is that when you go through a collapse of belief, you don't go back to where you were. You end up developing some different belief or worldview. And so, and then it irritates me when sometimes people on that side of apologetics will blame someone for having a fundamentalist view. And it's like, well, wait, they were taught to have that. Like, yeah. that wasn't like it just happened, And definitely exactly. certain personalities gravitate toward that, where some personalities, like free spirits, will never, ever have that kind of worldview. But
yeah.
But it's still encouraged almost. Like, it's not like you're going to hear somebody say, you're not going to hear someone correct someone for having too much of a fundamentalist belief, I guess, at church.
No, I agree with you.
Sometimes.
It wasn't just me.
There's letter of the law, spirit of the law lessons, like, so that's not totally fair. But anyway, I
agree with most of what you said, because I think for me that I would say that's what I was taught at church. That's what I was taught in the manuals, in the core of the curriculum. I'd even argue that's what I heard from church leaders at General Conference. So I would say, like, I'm not abnormal. I am the norm. Like, this is kind of what we've been taught, that this is the Mormonism that we've grown up with. You know, I would say, like, for example, I took the temple endowment very literally. So whenever I went through and we watched the video of the creation and Adam and Eve, I was like, this is actually how it happened. But then my wife, whenever she first went through, she kind of knew, or she believed, like, no, I think this is kind of more symbolic, or it's more to help us in our own temple endowment. I've now shifted more to that view. So some people can have maybe not so much of a fundamentalist, literalistic view. But that was definitely the Mormonism that I grew up with. And I don't think I was alone in that. And I don't think that was my fault. And I do think the church needs to take some accountability for that. I don't think it's fair to just blame the person, well, you had incorrect assumptions and expectations. That was your fault for believing prophets are infallible. But we've grown up being taught, like, the prophets will always teach the truth, they'll not lead you astray. So yeah, no, I totally understand people feeling that way.
Yeah. I also at the same time am having this other thought in my head that I was taught that prophets were not infallible. Like, I was taught that they could be wrong. Like, I had both lessons, right?
See, I didn't. Well, I knew prophets weren't perfect, right? So, for example,
Yes.
on my mission, President Nelson came and visited. He wasn't a prophet at the time, and he misquoted a scripture passage, and I was just like, "What?" I was like, "He's a prophet." I was like, I thought he's like a scripture scholar. So that was kind of like an eye-opening moment, like, oh, like he's human, like he's imperfect, but I still didn't believe that a prophet could be wrong when, like, speaking as a prophet, or like speaking in the name of God, or like,
So,
this is true, this is doctrine, this is revelation. So that was hard for me, is learning, like,
okay,
Brigham Young had taught Adam God doctrine.
over
That's
the pulpit.
doctrine. Yeah,
That's
those
interesting
were
because
tough for me.
I'm pretty sure I remember having lessons, whether it was in seminary or institute. I remember having lessons where they could be not perfect and speaking wrong, even over the pulpit. But the problem that I had after, and at the time, that was like, oh, okay, that makes sense. But the problem was that it's hindsight that you know that. So it was a problem for me because now it's still a problem for me, just because it's like, well, that's really convenient to be able to say that, because now the good things you can say, oh, that was for God, but then the things are not good, or things you don't want to use, you can say, well, that's probably him just talking as a man. And so then it
Right.
it,
Yeah. Yeah.
it kind of goes back to like what we were talking about. I'm sure you're fully aware of that problem, but
Yes. No.
um
It is an issue to have to navigate.
yeah. So, but at the same time, I still had that. I guess what I'm saying is I think I learned that as a Latter-day Saint. It's just that if you wanted to know what was true, it was the church leaders that were the final say, I guess. I felt like it wasn't left to personal revelation necessarily. I feel like that was
Mm.
pretty last. Personal revelation was only for yourself. You know, you could have revelation maybe for your family. A bishop can have revelation for the ward, but then like you can't like go against upper than, you know what I mean? Like I felt
Yeah.
like that
No,
was
it's a messy
also a
issue, because
lesson.
it's like, well, you can receive personal revelation, but it's only valid revelation if it falls in line with what the
Right.
prophets say.
Yeah.
But if prophets are fallible, if they can be wrong, then what if my revelation is right about X, Y, or Z? And what if I'm right? And what if they're wrong? But then you can't go against
Well,
the
then you
prophet.
could get some really weird versions of Mormonism too when someone takes that. I don't know. So you said you read Rough Stone Rolling. There was this part in there where Richard Bushman was talking about how great this was, and Joseph had these early followers and stuff, and he was talking about personal revelation, how you can receive revelation for yourself, but then there were other people that were receiving revelation too for the church, and he was like, oh no, this is a mess, it was
Yeah, like
becoming
Hiram
chaotic.
period.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's the
So
thing, because at the same time, I can understand why,
it
because
can't
there
work
needs
both
to
ways
be
really.
structure and order.
Yeah.
Like, it wouldn't make sense. It would be problematic if people were claiming personal revelations, but we're all contradicting
Yeah.
ourselves and contradicting, like, the
Yeah.
leader. So I can understand it makes logical sense to say, like, it's only a true revelation if it is in harmony with, the standard works or what the prophets are teaching. But you can also interpret that as, well, that's quite convenient as
Yeah.
well. I actually had a discussion with Jacob Hansen about this topic, and share different thoughts. But no, it's I think that's still an issue for people to have to navigate through. That's a complexity, because I, of course, grew up believing that prophets will always teach the truth and your revelation will always be in harmony with what they say. And if it's not, then it's incorrect revelation.
False
And
prophet,
now,
right?
yeah, and now there's a lot more. It's more up in the air. It's a little bit more messy and unclear.
Yeah. So we'll end with some rapid fire questions here. So who's your favorite apostle?
It was always Elder Dieter F. Uchtdorf. I just love the stories he tells. That I always felt like he was just a really compassionate and just very loving, very Christ-like apostle, and I always felt very inspired and touched by a lot of his conference talks over the years. I also like Jeffrey R. Holland. I think he's very charismatic, and some of his talks I've really enjoyed as well. I'm hoping he's speaking at conference this time.
I've heard a couple of people say they hope that. Why wouldn't he? Is he not well?
Well, yeah, he missed last conference. He was.
I didn't realize that. Huh. Well, yeah, he was one of my favorites too. The last little while I was believing, Lord, I believe, I listened to that talk like so many times.
Yeah.
I was relying on his testimony when as the fire was going out. So what are you most excited for about conference? And I guess you kind of answered that. You hoping that Elder Holland speaks.
Well, if I'm being honest, this is quite sacrilegious, but we're getting a Chinese tonight, and I'm very excited about having the Chinese takeaway while watching conference. So I'm excited about that as well. But I always get very excited about conference. I'm always like, woo, conference marathon. And then like 2 or 3 talks in, you're like,
yeah, it's a good, I mean, if you want to take a nap, that's flip it on. Like I always felt bad for sleeping through conference, but man, it was easy. Who's your favorite ex-Mormon?
That's a good question. So, can I give 2 or 3 people?
Yeah, for sure.
I don't know if I can pick a favorite. So, I really like RFM. I think he's really funny. He's really witty. I love his laugh. He's very intelligent as well, very well spoken. You know, he's a lawyer. And whenever he did the debate with the Midnight Mormons, I was like still in the church, but I was probably going through a little bit of a cycle again of like.
I was there.
You were there.
I was.
And I was kind of rooting for RFM, even though I'm like, well, I'm on that side. But I think he's hilarious, and I don't know him. I've not talked to him. We've exchanged a few messages, and I find a lot of either ex-Mormons or like podcasters or different critics have been very, at least civil and very polite with me over message. You know, respectful. So I like him, but I don't know him too well. I think in terms of ex-Mormons that I know, Anthony Miller is one who I really liked and admire. He's just, I feel like he goes against the stereotype and the mold of what a ex-Mormon is, like angry, hostile, and he's just like the nice, like he's nicer than most Mormons. He's really nice, really compassionate.
And he's nice to everyone, not just, that's a special gift.
Yeah, and he's very empathetic and very understanding. So he's in a mixed faith marriage. So I feel like that helps him to have more understanding and empathy towards Latter-day Saints. I don't know how he does it, because I think if I were to leave the church and lose my faith, I don't think I could interact or engage with so many believing Mormons, because he's in that thoughtful faith, and I don't think I could hack that. So I have a lot of respect for him for being able to dialogue in a respectful way with believers, and I just think like you can see he's all about building bridges, and trying to help people heal as well. It's not just trying to tear down and attack. And he's also quite nuanced, quite informed. There's times where he's almost given an apologetic defense when we've been talking about an issue. I'm like, that's actually quite a good apologetic, you know. So I think he's great. And Dan Vogel, I really like as well, who's a prominent historian and scholar on Joseph Smith, and I've interviewed him 3 different times on different topics, and I don't come to the same conclusion as him, but I feel like we've had really good discussions, and he knows the documents and the sources really well. I believe he's an intellectually honest critic. I have a lot of respect for him. I enjoy our dialogues, and I feel like he also is respectful to me and my beliefs, and I feel like we can talk without it getting combative or contentious. And I hope he feels that I've treated him respectfully as well. And he's also just a very nice, down-to-earth guy. I kind of expected when I first talked to him that he'd have a little bit of an ego or be a bit arrogant, but actually I think he's completely opposite. I think he's a really, really good guy. And he's also, I don't believe, interested in wanting to tear anyone's faith apart. So I have a lot of respect for him. So yeah, those cool. Three people would be my favorites.
Okay. So what is your, what's your favorite church culture thing? Because like obviously you have the gospel, right? But then you have church culture. What do you like about church culture?
So there's so many things. Like I love, like watching some of the dopey Mormon movies, like, like the RM or like the Best 2 Years or like Baptist at Our Barbecue. And I love just the wee like Mormon cheesy jokes that nobody else would get unless you're Mormon. I love, like board activities or like break the fast or like I just love being with Mormon people. I find like some of our cultural traditions quite funny. How like, we don't clap after like someone does like a musical performance,
a beautiful music piece that's like wow, and you're just gonna be like, okay, sit down now.
Yeah, sit down. It's just kind of awkward. And then it's like when it comes to like blessing the food, like it's not just like we bless the food to show gratitude, but it's like this thing. It's like we can't eat the food unless it's blessed. Like I remember as a missionary being in people's homes and they're like, they haven't blessed the food, and I was like, do I touch it? Do I not? I think that's kind of funny as well. But yeah, there's some things that I quite like about Mormon culture.
All right, and then what is there? Is there something that you don't like? I think we talked a little bit about it, but yeah, what are your like? Oh man, Mormon culture.
Man, there's probably so many things. I don't like sometimes the superiority that some members can, the rhetoric they can use sometimes. They're like, oh, we're the one and only true church and we have the fullness of truth, and all those in other religions that they, that they're misguided, or those people who leave, that they've been deceived. And because I think we should be having more the mindset of like, yeah, like we should hold to the beliefs that we have, but continue to be open and ever learning as well. Like that famous quote from Joe Smith that Mormonism seeks to embrace all truth, no matter where it comes from, sort of thing. And that we can learn as well from other faiths, other religions. We can even learn from people who leave the church, from their experiences. They might teach us some things about church history that we did not know, like happened to me. So I feel like having the mindset of learning from different resources, different places. And I think linked to that, I don't like the judgment that there is in Mormon culture. A lot of it, I think, can be about like your image. And sometimes I feel like there's a lot of a checklist in the church. Like, are you reading your scriptures? Are you praying? Do you have a temple recommend? Are you doing your ministering? Are you wearing, shirt and tie? And are you wearing a dress? And like a lot of like outward things. And I think we can get very much caught up in those. Are you wearing your garments? And judging people who we see as like they're not, on the straight and narrow, or they're not following the standards. I feel like there's a lot of judgment, especially as I read through the New Testament. Jesus seems to be really against the Pharisees, who are very hypocritical, who are so focused on like outward appearances of righteousness, and he has a lot more mercy and compassion towards sinners, but who sincerely want to repent and come to him. So I feel like there can be a bit of that sort of judgment in Mormon culture, and looking at sort of outward things to determine like one's worthiness or faithfulness.
So same kind of line of thinking as you were in swimming in the ex-Mormon space. What was your like favorite thing that you learned, or favorite saying, or the thing that you liked about that space while you were there, or that you still kind of engage with, I guess? But
well, I would say the quote I love the most, and I still like it even as a believing member. It's the one by I think is it Reuben J. Clark? It's at the start of the CS letter, like, if we have the truth, it can't be harmed by investigation. If we have not the truth, it ought to be harmed. I fully believe that. Like, whenever I was an ex-Mormon, I still believe that now. Like, I still believe that, like, if we have the truth, if the church is what it claims to be, then it can withhold scrutiny and investigation and challenge. Like, I've had certain priesthood leaders that have said to me, both at the beginning of my faith crisis years ago, but even since doing my channel, to like stop researching, to stop looking at criticisms, because if you research, you're just going to lose your faith and leave the church. And I feel like that comes from a position of weakness and insecurity. Like, if the church is what it claims to be, it can hold up. Like, we can find answers. We shouldn't be afraid at looking at what the criticisms are. And if we're confused by it, well, just dive in deeper, see if you can find answers. But I think telling people like, no, don't look into it, don't explore the criticisms or arguments against, like, you wouldn't give that advice to someone else in any other aspect of life, you know? So I like that quote.
All right. Least favorite thing in the ex-Mormon space, or saying, or whatever
Thing.
culture-y thing. I don't know if there's definitely an ex-Mormon culture.
There's maybe two that I'd give. I don't know if they're necessarily sayings, but they're things that I might hear quite a bit, which I feel like I sometimes feel like they don't maybe fully represent. So, for example, that I'll hear a lot of ex-members saying that believers are just going off feelings and like denying like all factual evidence. And what kind of irritates me about that is I can understand, like, if you haven't like seen God or seen an angel or heard an audible voice, then it's just like a feeling. But I would appreciate if they maybe represent it more as like people who believe they've had experiences rather than just a feeling. Because I don't believe that what I went through was just like I had a nice feeling, but I had experiences that I attributed to God, whether or not they were or not. I would categorize them more as spiritual experiences, or somebody who feels like they've had some sort of a sign or an answer to prayer, not just like I watched the Joe Smith movie and felt nice. You know what I mean? So sometimes I feel that that people's spiritual experiences can just be labeled as feelings. And I've listened to some people's spiritual experiences that they've shared with me, interviewed some people where it's like, I just can't say that's just a feeling. Like, if they really experienced what they did, that seems like a miracle. That doesn't seem like just a feeling. So that, and I think also like when they say like people who believe in, the Book of Mormon or in Mormonism, it's like they're believing in leprechauns or hobbits or like a flying spaghetti monster. I feel like that can be like, I feel like it's a bit, I understand what they're saying, because they're saying like, well, there's just as much evidence for all that imaginary stuff as there is for Mormonism or the Book of Mormon. Obviously it can be quite mocking, quite offensive, but I think like for me, for example, like, why do I believe in God versus like a flying spaghetti monster is primarily because I feel like I've prayed to this God and I feel like I've had answers to prayer, which has increased my faith. Maybe if I prayed to flying spaghetti monster and had a similar experience, maybe then I believe in it. So sometimes I feel like I don't appreciate those statements, but I understand where they're coming from.
Sure.
But I don't always appreciate them.
I'll tell you one that bugs me, and even though I feel the truth of it, it still really bothers me. I've graduated for Mormonism.
Yeah, actually, that one annoys me as well, because you know what, like,
because I feel like anybody, you have graduating moments all the time throughout your life where you have epiphanies and you learn things, and I don't doubt that is one of those moments. And I put my foot in my mouth and I said that to our neighbor, and I regret it. It's like one of my biggest regrets when I was going through everything.
Because whenever I first left, and I'm not saying here that ex-Mormons are arrogant or anything like that, but whenever I first left, I was maybe very overconfident about how sure I was that church wasn't what it claims to be, and felt like I sort of figured it all out. And that was within maybe like 2 or 3 months of just like quite intense research and looking at podcasts. But then I would compare it to now, and I was like, I know a lot more. But then I've noticed that like as I've dived in, it's like, oh, I'm actually always kind of learning. And that can be like a refreshing thing, but it's also very frustrating, because like sometimes you can feel like you've got something figured out, and then there's like more to it, and then it challenges your position. You're like, oh, back to the drawing board. Like, this is kind of irritating. Yeah, that can be a little bit annoying, because I try to have the mindset of like being open-minded and ever learning. But I think also some people might feel that like, oh, well, this is too complex for you to figure out. Can be almost like a gaslighting thing. So I think people can research and figure some things out, but I think it's being open that there's still always more to learn. Like Dan Vogel, who's probably one of the best historians and critics of Mormonism, of Joseph Smith, he says that he's still learning. That's what fascinates him. That's why he keeps engaging. He
Mm-hmm.
says sometimes the apologists teach him things, so he doesn't see them as enemies.
Or
And
less
I
than.
appreciate if that's coming from him. I'm like, wow, you know. And he sometimes watches my channel as well. So like, I respect that mindset.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't always appreciate that
It's
because there's
and I think it just
so much
comes
things you
off a
don't.
certain way, right? Like I understand why someone says that, right? Like I understand that someone, it's actually an olive branch in their mind because they're saying, I'm not saying that it was a terrible thing. I think it was good for me up to this point. I'm done with it now, right? Like
Right,
I don't
right.
think it's meant in a mean spirited way, but it definitely it should not be. It
I think sometimes people
it
who are still in the church can feel like
it doesn't.
we're not
It
as far
sounds
along as they are.
and I think one
They're
thing.
more enlightened.
Yes, yes, and I think, and it's the same thing with the Valor stages of faith. So, but I will say this, like I think that the reason that I've come to not like that phase is because I had the realization that it's there are people that I believe are like I want to be like, they have good character, they are wise and stuff like that, and they are still in the church. So like that trajectory of like self-improvement and becoming a better person, you don't have to leave the church to stay on that trajectory in my mind, you
Right.
know. But
Yeah.
at the same time, I can understand why people say that. I'm not saying that if you said that you're a bad person or anything, or if you still believe that you're a bad person, because I definitely
Yeah.
understand where that's coming from. But it is one of
Yeah.
my like, oh, don't say that.
Yeah. You can understand why someone might see that as like, oh, that's a bit condescending to
Yeah,
say that.
yeah,
But no, I can understand where they come from, that they feel like
sure.
they've moved on from it.
Yeah,
They're on another stage in their life.
yeah. All right. As you went through your collapse of belief, like when you were not feeling it, what advice do you have for someone that's like in the middle of that? Like any advice for someone? Um, yeah.
Yeah. Um, one I totally like understand, empathize. Like it's really hard. Like when you feel like you've grown up and you've thought everything was true, and you had this version of the history, and you feel betrayed, and you're learning all this information that you hadn't been exposed to before, and like you feel like you're going down the rabbit hole and you're questioning everything. I think my advice, and it's not necessarily that I want people to make the same decision as me or come to the same conclusion, but what I would say is maybe what I wish I'd have done more the first time is make sure that you have looked at both sides equally. Looked at like the best. If you like, look at what the critics are saying. Look at the criticisms and their arguments and the issues going against. If you're out for truth, then you should try to look out for the best, maybe faithful answers or scholarship or evidence. Take that into account as well. Don't just listen to one side, and then you can decide what you find more compelling. I would encourage you maybe not to make a rash decision, but then you can't just spend years or decades figuring things out as well, but to take things slow. And I would also say not to throw out God, because ultimately, the reason I came back was that I turned to God in faith, still believing that there was a God, that He could answer and speak to me, and believing that I had spiritual experiences and a revelation from Him. And that's what I would say. I believe that people can have that. I don't believe that's just unique to me, that I was special or chosen. I understand and have a lot of empathy and sadness for the people who feel like they've done that and not gotten an answer. And I've also had experiences in my life where I've been wrestling about something really urgently and I've not had the divine revelation. I'm like, what the heck? Like, and it's really hard. But I think that would be my encouragement, not to shut the door on God and to make the decision that you feel is right for you, like intellectually, logically, emotionally, spiritually as well. Like whatever decision you make sure it's one with integrity. And if you feel torn or conflicted, you don't need to make a rash decision. You can still figure things out. And yeah, I just wish them the best in their journey where it takes them.
Yeah.
And it's never the end of the story. So if they decide to stay in the church or if they leave the church, that doesn't mean that's how it's going to end. You know, people's lives, you never know what's going to happen.
Well, I think everyone can resonate that, like, when you're like in it, ever think you're going to leave. So I guess that if you believe you understand that now, then maybe you should understand that you could be like the Murph here and you might be back in the church. So,
Because people always say to me, like, it's only a matter of time within a couple of years, the Murphy's he's gonna leave the church. But then in my head, I joke with Dan Vogel, it's just a matter of time that I bring him back and he's the apologist again.
that's great. Um, yeah, I think there's some sound advice. I like, it seems like the things that helped me, like, I think when everything's happening so fast, it can be super overwhelming, and it can really affect your daily like life. I
Yeah.
remember I was like, I remember I had a moment where I like looked up from the computer and I was like, my kids are running around and like things are happening. Life was still happening, even though I'm having this moment like of a complete collapse of belief, but life is still happening. And so, and not that you can take it slower. I think that moment happened to me naturally. I think it happens to everyone that's kind of going
Yeah.
down the rabbit hole, but it's okay to take a break and slow down, and it's okay to touch the grass and and go do something for fun instead of trying to figure out the life's mysteries. Like,
Yeah.
I don't know. I think, but you mentioned something similar to that, and I can definitely second that.
Yeah,
Uh,
because you can spend a lifetime, and I probably end up well, you know, reading books and articles and looking at all the secondary questions. You could
you
spend a
don't have to
lifetime.
do it all in one night.
Yeah, you
You
don't have to
should
do it
be
all.
sleeping.
Yeah, and that's the difficult thing as well, is that sometimes believers or apologists can say like, well, there's so much information, articles on this which you haven't read, but it's like it's impossible for everyone to read every single thing that's been published
Yep.
on a topic, and that's why it's helpful to have different podcasts or different websites you're able to
Do
go
that
through
work
it and
for you.
kind of like synthesize it in a
Yeah.
way that can be helpful to be a resource.
Yeah. What was the most helpful for you when you were going through that? What did you find that was most helpful for you to just, and I'm not even talking about helpful to come back to the church or helpful or anything, just something that was helpful, because it feels terrible to go through that. Like, I would describe that as probably the worst thing I've ever gone through.
Yeah.
Like, what did you find helpful?
Um, in terms of like helpful in terms of what, like navigating through the faith crisis, or like
Hmm.
helpful in
Surviving it. I don't know.
surviving. Um, yeah, like obviously now there would be maybe certain resource, like if people are going through a real faith crisis, I usually recommend, you know, maybe check out this YouTube channel quickly, or this podcast, or check out this website, or you know, if it's this particular issue, you know, maybe check out this resource. I think for me, what I
Just
personally
certain
find helpful,
sources were helpful for you.
yeah, certain sources were kind of helpful. At least it's sort of like a quick fix, like because sometimes when people are in a real crisis, like they need something now. Like you can't just say like, well, just look up, you know, every article you can find on DNA and Book of Mormon. And
Hmm.
so sometimes they need something quick that you could send to them. So like for example, like I've really been enjoying this podcast called Church History Matters on Scripture Central. The two historians who've been doing a really thorough job in different church history topics. It's kind of faithful, but it's very thorough. They go through the sources very well, and I think it's I've learned from it, and I've really appreciated that. I've enjoyed channels like LDS Truth Claims or Latter-day Saints Q&A. I think they're good YouTube channels. I would encourage people, like, yeah, like you should check that out as well if you feel like you're more persuaded by the criticisms or what the critics are saying. I'm like, that's fine, but at least you've listened. You know, I at least appreciate people. At least you've listened, and if you're not persuaded, at least you know you want to try to listen to the best. At least for me, I think I find it helpful for me to feel like I've explored a topic and an issue quite thoroughly, to at least where it's like, okay, maybe I've not debunked it, but I at least have a lot more clarity on it. So like an example is I looked at every single source I could find on the translation of the Book of Mormon, because I wanted to look at all the sources, because I had read a book by Neville and Lucas who are challenging the seer stone in the hat narrative and promoting the Urim and Thummim, and their book kind of challenged me, and I realized that I'd only read a few sources on the Book of Mormon translation, like maybe like a dozen or so, and I was like, you know what? I was like, I'm just gonna read. I want to read every single source, so then at least I can have more understanding. So over Christmas, I read like 200 sources. It was like mind numbing. But then I did a video pretty much of like 50 or 60 of the most relevant ones, and I had a lot more clarity because I was like, you know what? There's a lot of mess here. There's a lot of like, there's a lot of consistency, but actually, the historical record is not clear. So I didn't find an absolute okay. This is definitively how it was done. I presented in my video what I think is most likely and what the different arguments or interpretations were. But I found like that really helpful for me, like really therapeutic to just be like, I'm aware and I've looked at all the sources and I can come to my own informed conclusion on it. If that makes sense.
Yeah. So just, no, that does make sense. See, yeah, I feel like by doing that, you can't be blindsided again too. Like you're just,
Yeah.
you pull yourself out of like being naive and at least you know about it. And, you know, you may not even, you may even be more convinced by the antagonistic point of view, but at least you know
And
about it.
I
Take your
feel
feet
from
out from
doing it,
under you.
I had a lot more understanding to where everyone was coming through with their view. I can understand why they're thinking no, it was just the Euromethon with the plates because look at these accounts. So then they're trying to explain away all the seer stone had accounts. Then I can understand people saying no, it was just the seer stone and Juice and Oliver were lying. And then I was able to see how maybe there's some consistency along all of them because some accounts refer to both spectacles in the hat and a seer stone in the hat. And I won't get into all that, but I found it empowering because I was like, oh, I have more understanding now, and I've looked. Maybe there's certain sources I missed, but I felt like I looked at them all, and everyone can sort of agree on, well, these are at least the sources. So I find that helpful to at least feel like I'm not missing anything on a topic, and then I can decide for myself what I find most likely.
Yeah. I think I just have a couple more. This is one that I wanted to ask you earlier, and I forgot about it, and I've remembered. Like, do you think there's anything you could have done to prevent going through a faith crisis? Like,
No,
what?
no, it was
What
inevitable.
is there a kind of belief that you could have that could have been fostered that would have prevented it?
No, I don't think so. I think it was inevitable. Even if I grew up like maybe like because critics will talk about like inoculation. So maybe if I had learned about Joseph Smith's polygamy or learned about Joseph using a seer stone or different accounts of the first vision, I think it was inevitable I was going to encounter this information. It was just a matter of when, not if.
Yeah.
And I think because I'm such an open-minded, curious person, I was always going to dive in deeply. So there's some people who aren't interested and don't want to look into it, and I am. That's kind of my nature. So for me, I think it was inevitable
I see.
for me to go through it and to wrestle with it. I don't think I could have avoided it. And I think there might be some people who might go through life and not go through a faith crisis, but I think everyone, at least from now on in the church, will at least encounter some sort of criticism or challenge in church history, or some evidence going against at some point. I think it's inevitable now.
That brings up another question. So, what about those people that don't go through it? Do they have a less accurate belief? Or is that okay to have a spectrum of beliefs within the church? Does that, like, do you hope for people to have the best belief? But what is the best
Yeah.
belief? Like, do you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
so obviously your beliefs changed. So, there's still some people in the church that have that fundamentalist literalistic view. Do you just let them be on their path? Maybe there's some people that are going to stay there. Is it a lesser form of belief or is it a fine belief?
Yeah, I don't know if I want to refer to it as like lesser or like I'm more enlightened or mine's
Right.
superior, because I think there's a difference between like you're more informed, maybe you have more knowledge, but for example, like I think like personally I think God wanted me to go through this journey, and to encounter some of these things and have maybe a more of a challenge, more of a thoughtful, robust faith, but one that there's a lot more complexity. Like it's not as simple or idealistic. But I think people who have tremendous faith, but it's more simplistic or literalistic, I don't think God would see that as any less can't think of the word, any less, not as good as
Yeah.
somebody who has faith but's more informed, if that makes it. Like, I think
Yeah.
it's, I don't think it matters so much about what you know. I think it's important to learn more, about history and facts, to have more an informed faith, but I don't think it ultimately matters that much. But I want people to be more educated and more aware. I want more transparency. I'm currently a Sunday school teacher, and I'm like, I taught the youth very briefly about Joe Smith using a seer stone as part of the translation as well. So I feel like I want to make them aware of that. But for those people who feel, if they don't want to look or learn about it, like, they're on their journey.
Hmm.
But I don't see it as like I have superior faith because of it. I think the way I would compare it for myself personally, because sometimes I felt saddened that I felt like my faith was so strong before my faith crisis. Like, I 100% knew, but then that shelf I had, like, immediately crashed with the books. But then I felt like my experiences that brought me back, not too many books were removed, but it was like I was given a new shelf. And there's times where
Stronger
it's like,
shelf.
yeah, more robust. And there's times where it's like, oh, it looks like it's going to collapse any minute. And then, like, oh, maybe another screw's just put in just to keep it going. And maybe some books are taken away. And then there's some new books added on. So for me, I at least feel that in some ways my faith is stronger because it's more informed, it's more nuanced, it's been challenged a lot
Yeah.
more. I don't believe true faith. I don't believe it's truly faith unless it has faced opposition or adversity that's
Hmm.
really challenged it. Um, so yeah, but I don't think necessarily that mine's superior. I just think personally for me, this was part of my to sort of advance along.
Yeah. You wouldn't take it back? You
The
wouldn't
faith
you would
crisis,
yeah, you wouldn't go back?
in some ways, like, of course, because ignorance is bliss. But I feel like I've connected with so many people since being on this journey. It's helped me to be a lot more empathetic and compassionate, more open-minded a person.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, like, some of the downsides is there's been periods of being conflicted or depression, or times where you're struggling with things, and that's not nice to go through. But I also feel like that's part of what we go through in life as well. But I think all the people that I've to connect with, I can see the good that's come out of it, and I feel like it's important because a lot of people are going through it, and I feel like they need to connect with people who have been through it, who have maybe come through another side, whether or not they've stayed in the church or left the church, like yourself or people like Anthony Miller. They need someone who can be an ear to listen to, or a support for them.
Yeah. I something you said there reminded me of something. It was definitely taught at church at several different points, and it's a thing that always resonated with me, and it still does to a certain extent. Just how, you know, a lot of times people will pray to have their trials go away, right? But then they don't realize that the prayer is to help them become stronger, right?
Right.
And I like that mindset, that idea that you're strong enough to get through the hard things in your life. Um, yeah, there was we went on a walk, and there was a sign out in someone's yard. I think it's probably from like a suicide prevention thing, but it was like, life is tough, but you're tougher, or something like that. Like, I like that resilient mindset of, like, if you're going to pray to God that he can make you stronger, not that he will make life easier for you. Right. So
Yeah.
yeah, that's cool. Last thing. Okay. Actually got through pretty much everything. So this has
Okay.
been fun.
This has
But
been good.
I want to know, like, if you could point someone, and it doesn't, if you can't think of one, you can maybe do a couple, but I like to link your favorite content that, and it can be your own content or someone else's. Like, if there's just like a favorite thing that you've produced, or a favorite thing, interview you've done, or a favorite thing that you've listened to that you really like, or something like that. Like, what is, if you could have someone watch one thing or two things or something, like, what would they be?
Okay, well, I'll give you one link in terms of a resource I would tell people to turn to. If there's one channel I would tell them watch this, and then I'll give one video from my. So if there's one YouTube channel, because this was one that had a big influence on me before coming back to the church, it's LDS Truth Claims. It's not very well known. It's by a guy called Brett McDonald, and he goes through about 35 lectures, and he kind of does about half of it looking at like evidence in favor for the Church of Smith Book of Mormon, then about half like looking at the criticisms. I think it's kind of heavy, so you kind of have to really watch it. Like if you're washing dishes and listening to it, you probably won't absorb that much. But I think that's a good resource. In terms of a video on my
one you're most proud of or something, I don't know.
I think the one I'd say I'm most proud of is the final episode I did on my Book of Mormon series, because I did maybe about 15 or 20 episodes on different topics or criticisms, and then I did probably over a dozen interviews with different people. So I felt like there was just a host of there's so many things encompassed when it comes to the Book of Mormon, and I wanted to give my own final summary and conclusion, and I wanted to steel man and provide what's my naturalistic explanation for the Book of Mormon, and fully steel man it, not do a straw man or misrepresent, rank what I see as the best criticisms against to maybe the weakest ones, then talk about why I'm not fully persuaded, what do I see as the best evidence in favor, how do I then harmonize, if I believe in the Book of Mormon, some of these challenges, what's my view of historicity translation. And obviously some people disagree with my conclusion, but there was a couple of ex-Mormons who said this is probably one of the most even-handed, fair and balanced summaries on the Book of Mormon. I took that as a huge compliment for me, and I was quite proud of, because the way that I did that episode, I was quite satisfied with it. So that's probably my own personal episode, the one I probably enjoyed the most. But so many great interviews that I've loved as well.
Cool. This episode that you were talking about, do you have like a playlist with this Book of Mormon series that you've put together?
Yeah.
And maybe I can link that as well as the last video in that
Sure.
playlist. I'm sure I can find it. If I can't, I'll message you.
Okay.
All right. Well, I will let you get on with your day. This has been interesting to set up because you're over in England, not England, right? Or you are in England? I can't remember.
I moved to England. I'm originally from Northern Ireland, but I moved over back in November for work.
Okay. Yeah. So anyways, this has been interesting to set up. I had to wake up early.
Yeah. Most people do.
All right. Well, yeah, thanks for coming on. And
yeah, it's been fun.
Hopefully we'll see you around.
All right. Thank you.
Yep. Bye.